Just a few questions. Did everybody got the copy from CRISPR yesterday? Yes? Nobody misses? You didn't? Okay. You want to do some copies? Yep. Come round here. One. Christine? Yes? Three more. And China. Need to come back with that today at some point, if it's possible. And now I think we should split in the three groups. And I was just thinking how to do, and I would suggest the group 2 and group 3, there are some issues that they are some sort of related. So those two groups will stay in this room, and group 1, it will go to the bar. Not the bar, to the restaurant, excuse me. Please not. Well, maybe it would be more recommendation if you go to the bar. And so if you read very careful the few sentences in each one of those groups, actually it's very clear what it is expected from those groups. And we trust the leaders that we are assigned to each one of them, that you will come out with some scope of the questions that they are requested for each one of these groups and as objectives, and also in some sort of a recommendation for the whole group for the plenary that we want to have later. So I will please ask to the people from group number 1 to move to the other, and the other people stay here. I will say group 2 and group 3, or 3 and 2, as you wish. And the constructor know, and the people assigned here know where. That the other thing is not necessarily that you will be assigned to only one group. You can move from one group to the other one if you have issues pertinent to each one of these groups, right? I think 10:30, half an hour is too short. Maybe at 11 for break, coffee break. Yeah.
Just wanted to be sure that the group thought that this was the best use of our time to do this. One is to actually go through the Crisco template and identify right from the beginning any areas that might need some additional words or a bit of modification. That's one suggestion. We do already, though, we have already asked everybody to give feedback on that. Everybody has a hard copy of the template, and the entire group, including group 1, has been asked to give that feedback. So to some degree we'd be anticipating what we've already requested. Another is to look at the broader issue of the estimation of mineral resources and reserves. I believe that the wording is something like, look at the guidelines for the estimation of resources and reserves. We could look to identify the main issues involved in the estimation of resources and reserves, without trying to get the wording or anything sorted out, but just the issues. Another would be the relationship between the Crisco definitions and the UNFC framework classification that sits outside of Crisco. But for many contractors at this stage, what they have may sit more appropriately in some box in the UNFC than in Crisco. So discussing that could be one of the issues. So I just thought I'd ask if anybody has any suggestions as the way forward so that we make the maximum use of our time. Yes, Caitlin.
We talked a lot about the issues involved in moving from inferred resources to indicated resources. But in writing these guidelines, we're addressing the whole taxonomy.
Yes.
So there might be work to be done on giving better definition to modifying factors. So that would deal with moving up from resources to reserves, which is part of the topic of our charge.
Okay. We could spend more time then on the modifying factors. Yes.
Good morning to all. I have basic difficulties in this document. question is to Secretary General, are you working for PISCO or the authority? Because this document we are calculating or we are taking further action by the authority, because we are not working for the PISCO. It means the contractor, if I understand correctly. And this template is for the authority we are formulating. And whatever process he has to take it to the university or the original stage, to LTC and demand council, all those things we talk. But we are not working on the PISCO. Because PISCO is an entity, if I understand correctly, which has been vetted by the authority to help the authority. And we are as a contractor of this particular area, I have a strong objection to this document, and it is headed by PISCO committee or this thing. It should be authorities document. Can I get some clarification?
Yes.
At the present time, the authority has absolutely nothing. We need a starting point. The end point is not a Crisco document. We are using this template as a basis to move forward. In the absence of this template, we have absolutely nothing to place in front of anybody in this room already. So this serves as a basis for us to start and see where we can go. What we end up with is not a Crisco document, but this serves as the basis for the work we're going to.
The outcome of this workshop will be authorities document.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. And thanks for raising that question, because it is a good one. I think we should also make it clear that Crisco makes this template available to anybody who wants to use it for any purpose that they see it useful for. It's not something that Crisco maintains ownership of in terms of when somebody takes it to use it, they then have to report back to Crisco. That's not the intent of it. It's a document that others can take and use, and then it becomes their own document. So, yeah. Yes?
The point is taken. In which case, I think we need to modify, if it gets converted to a document for authority, I think we need to modify the first page itself when it says this template for the public reporting of, etc., etc., etc. So we need to modify the text on the front page itself.
Yeah, I agree. What I'm trying to get at the moment is, should we spend our time going through the document to do that, or is it a better use of time to look at other issues? Caitlin raised the modifying factors. I think that might be something that we haven't spent much time on so far, but it's absolutely critical to moving from resources to reserves. Now, it could be argued that at the moment, nobody's quite ready to move, but because we're looking at a document that will be a template for the whole of the contractor's activities going forward into exploitation as well, it is a critical area. So I think that's one that is a very good suggestion. Yes, David?
I think that's a great idea, and I think that should be one of the things on the agenda, absolutely. But the other point, Caitlin's other point was that we're looking at the whole taxonomy, and as you mentioned as well, I think we also need to be aware that there are some contractors who aren't even ready to be inferred resources yet, so we really should be looking at that step into inferred resources to make sure those volumes aren't lost. And actually, I would throw a little bit of work back to the authority, and that this is going to be your document, so the level of disclosure or internal reporting to the authority themselves, you need to decide what that's going to be. And if you want to have reporting of volumes that are outside of the Crisco template now, we need to be clear about that so we can put definitions in place for that. I guess again, the point of this is not going to be a Crisco document. You know, the JORC document is not a Crisco document, it's the JORC document, because they've taken the template and instantiated it into that JORC code. And that's exactly what's going to happen here. So it's not inconsistent with the way templates used.
In bear in mind, those changes are very minor. So almost, if you look at all of the documents, they're virtually identical. The only changes may be on qualified, competent person, qualified person. It's still there. You take out competent person, it's no longer a Crisco template. But equally, so if I say take out competent person, I'd say take out transparency, take out materiality. They're three key principles. You can't take any one of them out. They've got to be there.
Let's get back though to the fact that the Crisco template is something that is there for somebody to use and modify in the way that suits their particular circumstance. So, and I think it's certainly a legitimate point that's been made that if the main purpose of using this document modified for the ISA is for internal reporting to the ISA at this stage, then there are requirements about the competent person that are not required at this point, because they're there to protect the public when you're reporting to the public. If we're not reporting to the public right now, then that requirement isn't there. So I don't see that the competent person issue should be a major stumbling block to what we're doing right now. I think we can put it almost to one side. Yes?
My personal view would be that we should focus today more on the classification of resources rather than going into details of each modifying factor, which is quite some time away, because we have not in fact resolved the issues relating to classification of resources itself. How do we move from inferred to indicated to proved, or to measure? So I think this should be addressed first. Time permitting, we should go to the next step.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any others? Yes, Lee.
We should define some terms for the authority to use, special for authority to use. For instance, we frequently use minor, commercial, but we have terms reserved. What's the difference between the reserved, minor and commercial? If the seminar, we should put into the appendix. And I hope just one term is used. If we use reserve, we don't use minor and commercial. But we can put these two terms into the appendix 1. Okay, and some other terms, for instance, mine site, deposit, ore body. We should give some explanation so that the contract can correctly used.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Caitlin, and then perhaps we'll move on to actually doing something. Yes, Caitlin.
It would be good also to look at guidelines for submissions to the authority's resource database. The resource database is part of the process of developing measures of reserves and resources, and at the conclusion of the exploration contracts, that data is supposed to be transferred. So something that then helps define the role of, and structure of the authority's database will be necessary to the contractors. So that would be another one to add in there. And then just the point that the whole purpose of this is to lead to seabed mining, and that requires reaching the reserve category. So I think that is an essential part of what we address.
Okay, thank you. Could I suggest that we start with looking at the resource categories, because that's the most immediate area that we're in right now, that we then move to the modifying factors, if we resolve the resource categories properly, that we need to address David's, well, I think as part of the resource categories, we should address David's points about if it's not in resources right now, where is it? And this is where the UNFC comes in. Then move to modifying factors, which covers the transition from resources to reserves. Then look at the point Caitlin just raised. And I think the general changes that need to be made in the template to words here and there and so on, I think probably it wouldn't be the best use of our collective time to spend time debating those. I think that can be done with feedback from the entire group and then going out with the suggested changes. So if that's okay, could we proceed on that basis? Yes. Okay. So I suppose the first question then is, how do we see what is required in order to report as an inferred resource. What would differentiate, if you like, something that is not classified as a resource under CRISCO from something that is classified as a resource? And I can give you a little bit of guidance on this before we discuss it. The key definitional requirement of a resource is that it is something that has reasonable prospects for eventual economic extraction. So it's not just everything that's been sampled or surveyed with cameras. That's legitimate to make estimates of those amounts because they're the basis for how you go further forward. But the key component of a mineral resource is that it has reasonable prospects for eventual economic extraction. So you have to have enough knowledge of the deposit, I'll call it a deposit at this stage, to be able to form that view, and you have to have applied some minimum economic criteria, such as you have to have decided on a lower abundance cutoff. In other words, the mineral resource can't include abundances down to 0.1, for example, because I think it would be generally accepted that nobody is going to try and mine seabed nodules with an abundance of 0.1 kilograms per meter squared. But 10 kilograms per meter squared is clearly attractive. But somewhere in there is going to be a boundary where you would say, well, okay, 4 kilograms is perhaps okay. And this doesn't have to be what is economically extractable right now. It's just trying to set a boundary for what has reasonable prospects for eventually being economically extractable. So it's generally set at a fairly low level, just so that you remove from it anything that has no reasonable prospects. So there's that guideline. So there's the abundance is one. Grade might be another one. You don't want to include nodules that have very, very low metal grades. That may not be much of an issue here because, as I understand it, if you have nodules, you tend to have grades that are of a general sort of average. But that's another criteria. You have to have, even at this stage with a resource, if you look at the guideline in the template, you'll see that it refers to things like you must have some idea of how you would mine it. Again, it's you can't include material that you know there is no chance you could ever mine it because of, I don't know, sitting on a very steep slope and there's just no conceivable way you can think of that you could mine that. That can't be a resource either. But you should include anything where technology may yet enable you to mine that. And you can foresee that the technology might be there to do that. So these are the sorts of considerations to take into account. If you've got estimates that you feel don't meet those criteria for one reason or another, then they sit in the UNFC in one or other of the available classification boxes. Whether we want to debate which of those boxes at this stage, I'd suggest that we don't, because that would open up another debate, but I think the principle should be adopted that they sit in the UNFC boxes outside of CRISCO. So with all of that, sorry, very long introduction, perhaps throw it up.
I'll just throw up one quick example about things that are perhaps not technically possible today, low abundance, things that are on a steep slope, where right now we don't see the technology to develop those. 25 years ago, there was no shale gas production in the United States. None of those volumes were counted as anybody's resources. Now 25% of U.S. production comes from that source. So it can change very rapidly, which is why I believe it is important that we put in place now the tools to capture that. Because we don't want whatever we produce right now to be something that's only going to be relevant to the current set of contractors in the current areas where they're working. We want something that will be relevant for the next 25 or 50 years of use in this domain.
About the boundary, about the cutoff
think it'd be good to keep in mind the principles that I presented yesterday about, or the day about specifications, or definitions, specifications, and guidelines. The Crisco template is built around very high-level definitions. The level to which you're mentioning there, going down to actual cutoffs of abundance or price, those are things that are best left to guidance. And I'd argue that that guidance is not something we should be addressing here today. That's too complicated an issue and too detailed an issue. We should be looking at the broader definitional and specification information. I think the definitions are here in Crisco, and I tend to agree with Matthew that we shouldn't be changing the definitions in Crisco, because for consistency with the rest of the mining industry, it'd be best to stay with those. However, we should be looking at expanding this to include the other information that the seabed needs, and then also writing some specific specifications for deep sea mining.
Yes, me.
I don't know, there's this sense whether it's in line with current practice or whatever, but somehow I think if we could focus on that, where it says the estimation of mineable areas, because I think that introduces the concepts of what have you, cutoffs or what have you, slopes and everything else, when such areas have been identified. I mean, I think that we need some type of way of defining that. And then after that, it gets into stuff like which shall include details of grade, la 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 la. But if we could get rid of, when I say rid, I mean if we could have some type of definition of the term mineable areas, I think it tells us what's out of the Crisco type of definitions. We can then deal with the comment that Dave has made, yeah, and we could look at those outside of what we're currently defining as mineable areas, which take into account technology and what have you. And those that don't fall in the Crisco category come from that. Those that fall into the Crisco category would be the details of grade, quantity of proven, probable, blah, blah, blah. But somehow I think that the key clause in this whole thing is the estimation of mineable areas, and which shall include blah, blah, blah. But these things have to be identified. There must be some kind of criteria used to identify them. If we could get rid of those, I think we could move forward. Yeah, it's just a suggestion, but that's how, in my mind, when I read all this stuff, that's what I see.
Yes. Yeah. I'll come to this section. Yeah, I think then, in order to resolve that issue, there could be, I guess, almost one simple question then. Do we equate mineable areas, as it is intended to be used by the ISA, with a mineral resource or with a mineral reserve? If we equate it with a mineral resource has reasonable prospects of eventual economic extraction, but it doesn't have to be demonstrated to be economically extractable at the moment. A mineral reserve has to have been demonstrated through a pre-feasibility study or better that it is economically extractable at the moment. So it seems to me that it probably fits better as a resource, but I'm not sure if that would be the intent of the ISA, though. Whether, I don't know if you can give us guidance on that.
Well, again, let me just read it out again. The estimation of mineable areas, when such areas have been identified, which shall include details of the grade and quantity of the proven, probable, and possible polymetallic nodule reserves. What proven, probable, possible nodule reserves mean is not clear to me.
I think, no, I haven't forgotten Bichon. I think that's the carryover from really almost Herbert Hoover days. And the way we would equate that now, because it includes the word possible, is that it's equated to resources. It's measured, indicated, and inferred resources. That would be my interpretation of it. So I'll come in a second. John, you had something?
Yes. You guys hear me all right? So Minerals is already being down this path because we've done this with the SMSs. And just like with Nigel, with SMSs, it hasn't been done before. So it's very difficult to definitively define a reserve, especially as a report under 43101, which is one of the strict codes under CISRISCO. But under 43101, there is a thing called a preliminary economic assessment. And a preliminary economic assessment can range from something quite vague through to something I suspect that's as near as doesn't make a difference to the sorts of assessment you'd make for a reserve estimation. I think under 43101 they have an economic assessment as well. It's a bit more detailed, but I'm sure the two almost overlap. So for Sawara 1, we weren't able to define reserve, but we're still building a mine. But we had to do a preliminary economic assessment, quite a good preliminary economic assessment. And the one material outcome of that preliminary economic assessment that is in our technical report is the definition of a cutoff. So perhaps the critical language, as Secretary General pulled out, is the need for mineable areas. It's just an area that we think is mineable, and that could be, we think it's mineable because of preliminary economic assessment, that the only declared inventory numbers for that area might just be a mineral resource. Thank you.
Okay, any other, sticking to this topic for the moment, any other comments on that? Okay, thank you.
Looking back to some of the work that was done before the Seabed Authority was founded, but in preparation for it, is a definition of mineable area. It is a concept that brings together the geological, geophysical data and the technological data. Mineable area can be defined as the area where four conditions apply. Nodules are known to be present. The grade is above a predetermined cutoff. The abundance is above a predetermined cutoff, and the topography is an acceptable nature. That's what we talked about yesterday. It includes both factors of slope and obstacles. In this, it uses a very low cutoff. It doesn't apply to predetermine that something below, that somebody might advance their technology to would suddenly change. But this is a good basic definition of mineable area. And if there are nodules outside the mineable area, they really aren't exploitable for these other reasons. So that might be a entry point or a new definition to add with regard to nodules in particular. I just put it out there because it's been through a lot of vetting.
Well, I think that does help to clarify it. In my mind, just hearing you read that, that equates to a resource as it's defined in CRISCO, I would say. Yes?
I mean, I'm just thinking aloud. Take forward from what she said. The two elements which constitute the mining areas primarily would be abundance cutoff and the topography including soil, apart from the cements and so on. Now, if we consider that these are the nodules sitting in the so-called mineable areas as resource, then we are contradicting one of the points that we have put under the nodule section. Slope angle gets into the modifying factors which translate into reserves, and therefore we are into a contradictory zone. My personal suggestion would be that the resources lying within the mineable areas will have to be considered mineable only when it is converted into reserves. Otherwise, we have to take that definition, slope as a part of the modifying factors, take it away from there.
Yeah, it's a good point you're raising, and this is the sort of thing, this is exactly the sort of debate we had in the early days of the JORC Code when we were discussing could you have resources and reserves, and how do you separate them, and if you're going to report resources, do you apply any economic criteria at all or none? Now, because resources in the CRISCO template are reported to the public, it was decided that we had to put some basic economic criteria in there to remove anything that had absolutely no chance of ever being exploited, so the public wasn't misled into, being told there was a huge number when a lot of it had absolutely no chance. But it is set at quite a low level. I think we could get around this by saying that, in fact, I don't think anything in the template would require modification in this regard, because I think there's enough generic language in here that just says that when you're reporting a resource, it must have reasonable prospects of eventual economic extraction. You must take into account how you conceive that you would mine it, and so if there are very steep slopes that there's just no conceivable way at the moment to ever mine those, they probably shouldn't be a resource. But if there's any doubt, what I would argue is put it in, because what we're trying to outline with a resource is really the inventory. We don't want to leave any material out that might become economic. So I always tell people to err on the side of putting it in, with an explanation as to why you decided to do that. So if I could just maybe sum up this point, just see if everybody's happy with it. Based on what Nii and Caitlin have told us, the mineable area can be equated with the mineral resource under CRISCO. There are minimum criteria that you have to consider when reporting mineral resource, but they're set at quite low boundaries. And I don't know that at this stage we even need to try and specify them. I think if we try to specify a cut-off grade now, a cut-off abundance, we would have a lot of debate, because I don't think we could all agree. I think that's where we leave it to the judgment of the person who's doing the estimate. I think 4 is reasonable for all of these reasons, or I think 3 is reasonable, or I think 5 is reasonable. And as long as there's disclosure, then everybody can see the reason for doing it. So, is that okay? Are we agreed on that point? Yes.
Pat, if I could just make a comment. If you think back to the slide that I had up the other day, which talked about Australia's national inventory, there's parallels with this. This is a jurisdictional inventory that we're after. And one of the ones that I pointed at was bauxite. We've got a known resource of bauxite that's been categorised as a JORC resource by the companies, but around 60% of the inventory resource in Australia for bauxite is where somebody that's not a competent person under the JORC code, it's somebody that's a geologist employed by Geoscience Australia, so a government geologist, has taken an assessment of the likely area, and there's some parallels with seabed mining with this bauxite. It just extends over very large areas, very similar countryside, very long distances between sampling points, but there's some certainty that you've got the resource. So that has managed to be moved into the Geoscience Australia inventory for Australia. So for bauxite, only about, I think it was 37% I read out the other day, is a JORC resource. The rest is a known resource, but with a very low level of certainty, which is pretty well what we're talking about here. We're talking about a mineable area, but we don't have the level of confidence to know for certain exactly the tonnage, and we don't have the exact precision for commercial certainty. Thank you.
Thanks. Yes, Lee.
In page 32, that is the discussion of relative accuracy, confidence of resource reporting. My question is there should be a unified requirement for the accuracy and the confidence of resources for the I think that's no problem. We can give the accuracy and the confidence for the resources. But the problem is, this is the global or local. If global, no problem, okay? we can give the accuracy confidence, give the error and the related confidence limit. If local, we have a problem. What is the area? And camera use 3 parameters, give the error 15% relative error, and confident probability 90%, and 1/4 mining area for measured, 1 year mining area for indicated. So if according to this criteria, we have to take more samples. So I don't know what's the requirement by the authority. So I think we should give a guideline. If the requirement is for global or requirement is for local. If for local, what's the area? Okay. If no such parameter, it's hard to do for the contract to meet this criteria.
Pedro wants to comment in a minute. I'll just say again that what's in Table 1 are guidelines that are applied if it's applicable, if it's appropriate in the circumstance. People are incompetent persons, or whatever we call that person in this scenario, are encouraged to discuss the confidence and accuracy that they see in there that applies to the estimate as a means of improving the communication so that people reading it have got a better idea of, okay, you've called it indicated, but can you give me a bit more background as to why you think that's indicated? So, yeah, hang on a second. Wait a minute. Pedro's going to speak first. So, I think, and the local global is part of that. What scale are we talking about here? I think to get into the discussion of the accuracy and the confidence limits that might apply to different categories we've never managed to resolve that in the 25 years I've been working in reporting standards internationally, because we just haven't been able to get good agreement. I think it's something that could possibly be done here because we're dealing with effectively one deposit. But I think it's a debate that's going to take far longer than we can even start here, except perhaps to record that we think it would be a good idea to attempt to do this at some stage in the future. Pedro, you had something to say?
Thank you. Just to add that, during the exploration program, all contractors will conduct the work, the best work, where at the end of the contract of exploration, the possibility to go for exploitation. The paragraph that the Secretary General just read is the type of data, the type of concept that the contractor must give to the authority upon the expiration or termination of this contract. So in this sense, I think that the mineable area would be the area where the contract has the best classification of resource. It can be inferred, it can be indicated or measured. Hopefully it is measured, but it will be the area that the contractor will recognize as the best classification for the resource. So I think we can proceed in this.
Just to clarify though, that's opened up that debate again. Are you saying that the mineable area should be, if you've got measured, indicated and inferred resources, it should be the measured resources, not the indicated and inferred as well?
Well, yes, probably also. But if you have the measured resource, probably this will be a preferred mineable area compared with that of inferred resource.
Yes, I would say that the way Caitlin read that guidelines, it seemed that most people were in agreement that fitted the generic sort of mineral resources. Within those, you will certainly have some that are better known, and they would probably be the areas you would target first for mining, absolutely. But it seemed that most people were comfortable with the idea that the mineable area, as used by the ISA, equates to a mineral resource that can be measured. Okay, that's fine. Matthew, you wanted to say something?
Yeah. If you've got concerns about what goes in
Can you use the so people can think?
is it on? Okay. If you've got concerns about what gets put into and reported publicly according to Crisco, you should probably have a look at some of the statements produced by Australian companies on the JORC. I've done a lot of these, and some of your concerns, you know, it's the way that the competent person words it in each talking point. And so,
the competent person's responsibility.
yeah, so what I'm suggesting is maybe just get us a few copies of some of these statements to see what goes in to these reports, so you get an idea of what goes in there, because they're all different. Competent people interpret these differently and will put different aspects in. As you say, local confidence or global confidence. A lot of the time it's global. It's a description of, you know, your confidence in your geology, continuity, your assaying and so on. And sometimes they get down to the level of conditional simulations to get an indication of confidence of the estimate. Very rarely. Okay? But it'd be a good idea just to have a look at some of these examples so you get an idea of what goes into it. The NI 43101 is an extreme example. There's an awful lot of information that has to go into that report. For a JORC statement, it's only 12 pages. At the moment, the 2012 requires a little bit more going into it. So the latest statements have a lot more than the earlier statements. So if you look at statements from up to 2012, they'll be fairly short. They'll only probably be a couple of pages and have this table with a few paragraphs filled in with comment on each aspect. But the latest 2012 is a lot more detail. But have a good look at that. It'll give you an idea of what to expect. And maybe some of your concerns might be addressed when you actually go through that. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. Yep.
Yeah, as a contractor, I come back to the issue raised by the Honourable Secretary General. The requirement that was read out about the mineable areas and reserves, so on. Did I understand that as a contractor now, this translates into identification of measured, indicated, and inferred resources, period. No mention of mineable areas, no mention of reserves. Is that the understanding we go with as a contractor?
I'll perhaps give my response to that, but others then say. I would say yes. It seems that the room has agreed that the mineable area, as it's used in the ISA, equates to a mineral resource. It might be 100% inferred at this stage. It may have inferred, measured, and indicated, but it's.
So you remove the term mineable areas from that population?
I don't know that. I guess the ISA it's already in the documentation, so I don't know whether you want to.
The rules, regulations, and procedures of authority at the present time speak to mineable area. Whatever we're doing, if you change these words, you have to get approval from the council. I don't believe that's the purpose of this exercise. So we do have the mineable areas, and I'm saying, to the extent possible, let's stick to what we got and make our definitions accordingly. Otherwise, to go and say it was during Herbert Hoover's time or what have you, it's going to take a long time. Members of the council will have to agree, let's change all of this formulation. Let's see to what extent we can work with what we've got here and make the system flexible enough. I read mineable areas, but I also say that until somebody shows me that the nodules can be collected from the bottom, there's no way I can describe whatever is in this so-called mineable area as a result. Yeah, and I think we were getting some general agreement on that. I don't think we're here to. It's in the convention, it's in the regulations, and it's part of the contract that every contractor has. This appendix is part of everybody's contract, whether it's for polymetallic nodule, whether it's for sulfides, whether it's for cobalt-rich crust. these words haven't been changed. I just took the formulation from the contract because that's what I'm doing. And this is what every contractor is asked to produce. And I would prefer it if we could make the definitions for these things so that every contractor is on the same page. Let's not start the process of trying to change the words because that has big time implications and this will take forever. So please, let's work with those words. Thank you.
I'd like to move on to how we transition from inferred to indicated, because I think that's also a very big issue we need to discuss. So, Caitlin, have you got something specific on that?
It was just to say that minor area is defined as refer to the whole, anything that could be classified as reserve under any reasonable long-term projection. It is not referred to reserves, just to resources, including referred.
Yeah, so you're confirming what the general
broad definition. It
yes.
does not require any modifying factors, only those 4 points.
Could I suggest that we move to, I think probably the other big discussion point in the resource area is how we transition from inferred to indicated. The transition from indicated to measured, could I suggest that we put that to one side for a moment? If we do want to get talking about that, in general that's a less critical issue. It's one that tends to come in when you're financing and how you intend to finance. But the transition from inferred to indicated is absolutely critical because that defines how much of what you've outlined can be converted to a mineral reserve. So now at the moment, indicated, and again, the words are very general, of course, because this template covers such a wide range of deposit types. But basically, it's saying that indicated resources is an estimate with. I just don't want to get this wrong because it's so important. So it's on page 12 of the template. And I won't read the entire thing, but the first paragraph or the first sentence says an indicated mineral resource is that part of the mineral resource for which quantity, grade or quality, densities, shape and physical characteristics are estimated with sufficient confidence to allow the application of modifying factors in sufficient detail to support mine planning and evaluation of the economic viability of the deposit. Now that's a pretty generic description, intentionally so. I don't see any problem with that applying to seabed nodules. In detail, as we've said before, you're now starting to think about some of the modifying factors, even though you're not converting yet to reserves, but you have to think a bit more about them. And hang on for a second. But the main criteria here is that you have sufficient confidence in that estimate to apply some criteria to allow you to convert to reserves. You may not actually convert to reserves at this point, but you have enough confidence in the estimate, you believe it's of sufficient certainty that you can go ahead and apply those criteria and produce a reserve if you're ready to do that. And a reserve is something that can be shown to be economic at the present time on the criteria that you've selected, and it's the sort of thing that you would go to your board with, or you go to your finances with, and so on, to show that you've got something that's economically viable, rather than just potentially economically viable. So that's the broad sort of guideline. Matthew, did you want to say something?
Yeah, in the industry, the mining industry, one method of helping to clarify what goes into inferred, indicated, and measured is basically to consider that measured is plus minus 15% variability on a monthly production basis. Indicated,
3 monthly.
well, monthly. Indicated is usually half yearly and inferred yearly. So it gives an indication that in order to define the inferred, indicated, and measured, you utilise knowledge of your mining process, because that indicates how much variability and how much precision you need in your estimate to cover that variability during production. Because measured is a pretty tight category, and you need to know exactly how much you're going to get within a very tight level.
Okay, so looking at the transition from inferred to indicated, any comments on that? Yes. Sorry. I mean, there are some generic guidelines, and in many ways, I think they're okay. I think the additional clauses that we're putting in that give you guidance as to the sorts of things you need to think more about will help in that decision making. Things, for example, like at the inferred stage, you might say that the sorts of sampling procedures that are known to underestimate, that using those for 100% of the estimate at the inferred stage, you might think that's fine. But as you move into the indicated, you might want to say, well, I want to have sampling methods that give me some more certainty. That's one option. I don't say that should be done, but these are the sorts of things you might want to think about. But if everybody believes that generic sort of guidelines that are given in the template are adequate, then I would suggest that that's fine. You don't have to look to add additional criteria or words if they're not needed. Okay, wow. I think we should go and have coffee on that basis, because I thought that was going to be a big one. Well, I don't know if on that basis, I'd suggest again not addressing the indicated and measured either then, because really you would address one with the other. They're degrees of application of the parameters that you choose to apply. So, and of course, everybody's got this document, everybody's got a chance to look through it at a bit more leisure, rather than just sitting around this room trying to think of words right now or criteria. So, what we decide, I assume that what we come up with now isn't fixed in stone right away. We've got time to get feedback from everybody over the next few days if they think about other things.
I mean, the idea is we'll do some work in each group, and then we all come back together, and we'll report on what we've done in each group and get comments from the others as well.
We're at 10 o'clock now. I didn't know whether that was coffee or if it was 10:30. I think this would be a very good time for David to talk. Now that we've essentially covered resources, we need to cover the area, what you do when you have material that you've estimated that doesn't yet fit the Prescott categories. I think this would be a good time for David to speak there.
Yeah, I think there are three key categories within the UNFC system that are not, or classes rather, I should say, that aren't captured in the Crisco template or that are of relevance to you. The first is around the area. Well, they're all related to potential future recovery. Okay, clearly. And the first category is are volumes that are associated with non-commercial projects. So these are volumes that you have identified. You have a relatively decent handle on the volume that's in place associated with them, but you do not see the potentiality for any future commercial development. And as has been said repeatedly, the Crisco template, inferred resources means you have to have some view that this can be potentially developed at some point in time. And as I mentioned before, 25 years ago, this is where shale oil would have fallen into this category there. And if we hadn't captured those as potential resources, I'm not sure whether those have been progressed into development stage. So that's the area of non-commercial projects within the UNFC system, if you want to use the nomenclature there. Those are things that are falling in E3, F2, and then G, 1, 2, or 3 level, determining the levels that will be associated with those volumes. So that concept of volumes identified that are non-commercial, and I guess you do have some of these now. These would be things that would be on slopes that you can't develop now. These would be things that would be much lower abundance that you see any potentiality to develop. So, Matthew mentioned here is that, although you've got a cutoff today of what you see as being abundance, doesn't mean that 10 years from now that number might be substantially lower. The second category that I think could potentially be of interest is the issue around additional quantities in place. So these are volumes that are or quantities within your mineable area right? So they're within the area that you're going to be mining, but will not be recovered for one reason or another. So this, I mean, this is not my domain, so I don't know what area. These could be volumes within the area of recovery where perhaps localized abundance is small enough that you choose not to go, and you can actually, as you're using your sledge, you're going to miss that area for whatever reason. So these would be within that area that you're choosing not to do for whatever reason. The third one is in the area of exploration results. The Crisco, we actually haven't mentioned this, but the Crisco template also has exploration resources, exploration results they call them. So these are areas where you potentially have potential for recovery, potential projects, but you haven't yet developed them to a stage where you would call them a resource yet. So that's covered. But there are also the potential of additional quantities beyond what you think would ultimately be reportable under even exploration results. I would argue that's probably of lesser importance right now for the purposes that you want a classification system. But I believe those first two, non-commercial projects and additional quantities in place, should be considered to be added to this. They might not be of huge use to the contractors today in developing things they're trying to develop today, but I think they would be of use to the authority taking a longer term view.
Could I just clarify, Dave, the additional quantities in place, which boxes were those?
That would be 3, 4, and then 1, 2, 3.
Sorry, 3,
4. E3, F4, G, 1, 2, or 3. And on the certainty of the quantity there.
Any comments on that? Okay.
We have limited time. We have an objective that needs to be met by January for that. So I agree with the whole of the UNFC template. And I see resources in the seabed that I can't categorize under mineable area, under resource, or reserve. But I'd really like to keep what little time we have focused on the immediate reporting requirements that have to be written into regulations in 4 months.
Okay, thank you. Paul?
Okay, could I just get David to elaborate further? If we were to use these categories, classes, whatever terminology you want to use, how would the jurisdiction, the ISA, then use those to collate a national inventory? You'd use those as like with a caveat that they've got certain limitations, and then they'd be able to be reported.
Well, I guess it's fun to hear you reporting. This is what you're, because let me address Caitlin's question first here, and then I'll get you, because actually they're related here. First off, I believe the purpose of this meeting is to develop a classification system that can be used in lab, can be used to meet the needs of the issue that's immediately in front of us, but also know from past experience it's very hard to change a classification system once it's put in place, and they shouldn't be touched very frequently. It's not a very big deal to put the scope within the classification system that we're developing now to define these terms and to capture and to have space for them to be captured. We may choose to not ask people to report those or disclose those to the ISA now, if that's your issue. So I'm not trying to put any burden on anyone. I'm just trying to get you to set up a system, or suggesting to you that you'd be better placed to create a system that captures the entire geologic endowment now, and not have to change it and retrofit it in place later. This would then give you something that's going to live and be a bit more evergreen. Then to Paul's specific question, again, this would be up to the ISA to choose if they want to capture this information, if they want to have it publicly reported. I mean, it's up to the ISA to choose that, make that decision whether they want to gather that information. I would suggest, in line with the Crisco template, these aren't things that necessarily should be publicly disclosed for an investor point of view, clearly, but they are important for understanding, effectively, if you're the owner or steward, I guess is a better word, of these resources, knowing what is completely there and potentially to be discovered, I think is part of your role.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's precisely the answer I was seeking. What this is about it's creating a national inventory, a jurisdictional inventory. It's not about producing, at this stage, a commercial, something that you need to take to a stock exchange. You're just wanting something to get a fix, an idea about the quantum of what you've got, and a way to compare the quantum of what you've got between different areas within the area, or different sort of contract areas within the area.
These are volumes that you've got in your inventory, but the sheer fact that you've put them in these two categories means today they are worthless. They have no commercial value, or they were not going to be developed in the foreseeable future, but they are there.
And for that reason, they're worth reporting, and they're worth having the information there available for people to use if they see fit.
In fact, everything that you're calling an inferred resource today, I would argue 15 years ago, was not an inferred resource. It was sitting in these categories here. So where were you capturing those before? You had them written on a piece of paper. I'm just suggesting that it's good to actually call those volumes something and identify.
Okay. All right. Well, I think, is that okay, Dave? I've made notes on it. So yeah, that probably addresses most of the issues around resources. Now, I mean, there's all sorts of other issues because there's lots of stuff in the Crisco template and so on. Most of it's guidance, but I think we've probably tackled the main ones. Unless somebody can think of a key issue to do with resources that we haven't tackled. What we can do, perhaps we could take the break now, because what I suggest is we move on to modifying factors in that case and look at those areas. We could start doing that now and break at 10:30, or if people want to take a break now. So,
I just want to make sure that the coffee is ready.
oh, you can. Caitlin, do you want to lead a little bit of discussion on this, or will you just rate it basically as this is a topic we definitely need to talk about, but did you have any particular points you want to make on it, or should we just basically start it?
The only compromise is that we needed to give some concrete guidance as to particularly that break between inferred and indicated. And to that, I think we need to rely a lot on the people who prepared this 101 document to say what do outside observers think that point should be.
Right, okay. Well, we were going to move on to the modifying factors now, which is essentially resources to reserves, rather than the inferred and indicated. So
I think the best we can do is identify what they are to be considered.
yes.
We can't really say a particular degree of recovery efficiency justifies that. That's what we have experts for, is to make that judgment. But we can go through and give at least an illustrative list of those things that describe what we mean by the specific modifying factors.
Okay. Well, if coffee's ready now, and what do we take? Half an hour break? Was that the plan? Or let's say half an hour break, so we come back at, I don't know what time it is. We come back at 11:15 then. If that's, okay, thank you.
And I think a good timing would be probably around 11:30. So we have a little bit more than half an hour to finish the other work. Yes?
And then lunch is...
And then lunch, then you have... At least you have from till 12:30 or quarter to 1. Lunch before 1 and also will be there.
Okay, shall we reconvene? I believe that we're going to get on to modifying factors now, and they are, well, they're listed in Figure 1. So perhaps that's the best. So that lists what are perceived to be the modifying factors in, if you like, traditional land-based resource and reserve estimation. Mining, processing, metallurgical, economic, marketing, legal, environmental, infrastructure, social, and governmental. Now that's pretty wide, as you'll agree. Essentially what they are is almost a table of contents for the technical report that you would do to support moving from resources to reserves. They are the issues that you would look at. You have your resource estimate, which is potentially economically extractable. You would look at how you're going to mine it and apply your best estimates of your mineable areas from that. I shouldn't use the word mineable area because we've got another definition for that, but the area that you expect to actually mine compared to the area that you thought potentially you might mine. You would look at when you take the nodules up into the ship, what you might lose, so that's the losses on mining. I don't know whether dilution comes into effect in a traditional way, probably not, but it's the additional non-economic material that you extract with the mineral when you mine it in a traditional sense. You would look at the processing and particularly the cost of processing and the recovery, how much you expect to recover from your processing. Metallurgical has got a different category there, but it's pretty much the same as processing. It's looking at the metallurgical characteristics of the mineralization and any impact they might have on how you actually profitably mine this deposit. I think the other ones are probably self-explanatory. I won't go through them in detail. Perhaps before we look at each of these, is there a factor that people believe is unique to seabed nodules that hasn't been listed here? John, yes.
Yeah, it's a factor that I actually don't think is unique, but it's one that often has to be thought of very early, and that's the factor of weather. So actually there are land-based equivalents where you have the same issue with weather. So there are mines up in the Arctic Circle where you can't work for a large part of the year, and there are mines in the tropics where you get monsoon rains that pretty much shut down operations for a large part of the year. But foremost, I think, when you look at any ocean activity, is you have to think about weather. So I would propose it's not something that needs to be added, because there are these land-based equivalents. Some of the mines north of the Arctic, they shut down. I think in the case of the deposit in Norilsk in Russia, the river, the Yenisei River that takes the ore out to the North Part Sea is frozen solid for, 3 or 4 months, 6 months of the year. So no ore can be exported, so everything has to be stockpiled, and then suddenly in spring the whole lot comes out in one big flood to the markets. And I know that some of the laterite mines in the Philippines, in the wet season, that pretty much shut down, so that ore supply from the east and west of the country comes at different times of the year because of the prevailing weather. So for any nodule mining operation, there's often a cyclone season you need to consider. But I think the impact of that is no different to these land-based equivalents that I stated.
Okay, no, it's a good point. There could perhaps be maybe a couple of points in the guidance notes somewhere just to remind people, but yeah. Okay, Caitlin.
I think I overlap with a number of yours. Mining technology cost transport, because transportation is a big part of this, and if that's ignored, the commercial feasibility is really mischaracterized. Processing efficiency and cost of regulatory compliance, which the regulations at least will be different in sea. You'll have IMO regulations and state implementation of them. Commodity prices is probably the biggest single thing to consider. Benefit sharing costs, both at the national and international level. Supported management costs, material losses, which you mentioned, waste disposal and environmental costs, because you're dealing with a lot of stuff that's being brought on land and has to be done with when the processing through. Those capture a lot of the modifying factors, but they could be lumped together in many cases as cost of processing.
Right. Okay, thank you. Anything else? Looking just at one that might be missing. Yes.
I think, as you put in the section of nodules, the topography, the slope frequency, which we said should be clubbed with the modifying factors. So I think that should also be included.
One maybe to think about, I don't know, depends on, again, how the ISA intends to use this, but there's the sort of broad one of governmental factors. Now that's obviously meant to address, if you like, anything that's related to the entity or the body that has the responsibility, if you like, has ownership or stewardship, I guess in this case. I don't know whether it needs specific addressing in here. I don't know if anybody's got a view. Mr. Lee, do you have any view? Okay. It's pretty broad, so in some ways I think probably governmental factors can remain as... It's not as though... These are really here to say these are the main issues that you would consider when you're looking at actually working out what is economically extractable. In many cases, just common sense. You will do what you need to do to work out what that is, and you'll take into account all the factors that are going to have an impact, both financial, social, environmental, and factors like mining that modify the estimates. And that becomes part of the study in the table of contents. So it's really just making sure that we haven't missed a major category, and I think that we've had some good points here. And then if there's anything about any one of these that we need a bit more guidance on, we should address that. Yes, Kate?
One other thing is, if this is only for the Seabed Authority, this doesn't count. But if it's for anyone evaluating a deep seabed nodule mine, international recognition of title. I would hate to have somebody in the United States try to figure out the feasibility or calculate resources without considering what it's like to go out to no one recognizing your right to mine.
Okay, yeah. Okay, well, looking at the individual factors then, and we've dealt with a little bit of this under the special clauses. Are there any, is there anything else, you know, with the mining, with the processing? Again, I don't know if everybody's had a chance to read through the whole of this template. There's a lot of general guidance there. So if anybody's got a suggestion with respect to any one of the modifying factors, including if anybody wants to suggest an actual criteria, if you like. The template is kept deliberately broad, as I've said before, because it covers a range of deposits. In this case, it's covering one type of deposit. Do we think it would be a good idea to be actually specific about one or other of these modifying factors? Yes, Caitlin. Yeah, I think we need somebody to sort of almost lead us, because it's such a general topic. It's a little hard to actually get into.
One of the tools for moving from resource to reserve is a pre-feasibility study. Whether we specifically say pre-feasibility study or something more general in studies that address these factors, I think that process, a clearly defined process for addressing the modifying factors is an important part of this. A pre-feasibility study may be one way to satisfy that. I don't know whether we should mention that as a specific item or not, or a study at the pre-feasibility level to address these modifying factors as needed to move from resource to reserve.
Yeah, I think that's already there. I think it's actually stated as, in order to move from resource to reserve, you must undergo a study that's at least the equivalent of pre-feasibility study. So Now, whether you would want to actually specify the contents of a report, I'd suggest not in this template, but maybe further down the track, as you take this and modify it in detail for the ISA, you might want to add something like that. At this stage, it's almost implicit in all the guidance that's in here what the context of that report would be. There is actually a definition of a pre-feasibility study that actually itemises the sorts of things you should take into account.
So do we really need to go into much detail? I mean, it sounds like that may mean that we don't need, we would only need to provide guidance for those things that are unique to deep seabed mining. And other than the international benefit sharing, I'm not sure what is added to, well, maybe our people who've been doing the studies can tell us if there's anything unique to seabed mining that an analyst should be reminded of in conducting one of these studies.
Sean, have you got any thoughts on that, or Matthew? Both shaking their heads, so I guess you would say that the generality of the guidance that's given in a document like this is sufficient to guide you. Okay.
Yeah, there's marketing, there's legal, there's economic.
Pretty much everything.
Yeah. Pretty much everything will fit under that.
Yeah, I was thinking of guidance to somebody who has done these studies before for land-based resources. What would they need to know if they were sticking their toe into seabed mining? And if there's only common sense to consider, then you don't need to add anything.
Right.
Yeah, the benefit of a competent person is they should address this specific like subcategories, because every deposit is different, every national jurisdiction is different, everything else, every mining act is different, everything else. But,
I think we're going to be finished well before everybody else at this stage. But, in some ways I'm not surprised, and I think it's actually encouraging because this is such a general sort of document, and I think maybe now that most people have a chance to read it, they might be a little bit more comfortable with what's in it. It's really just trying to help the company to do its estimate, to report it. It doesn't impose any real constraints that affect the way you work. It's really just as the Secretary General was requesting right at the beginning of this. It's a framework that enables people to report in a common way and in a way that satisfies what's required at this stage of the work. And so, I mean, I think if we feel that we don't need to do much more with this template, I think we can really step away from it and tackle something else. And there's still time for feedback for anybody who wants details. You know, please change the words in this clause or this clause. That can all be sent to whoever's coordinating this. Okay. Yes, but I was trying to remember what the next item was. Was it something you mentioned, Caitlin? This is stepping away from the template now. The form of the data.
The resource database.
Yes. Now, is that something we? Yeah. Okay. So we're stepping away from the. Yeah.
Some of this discussion, and particularly last summer when UK Seabed Resources discussed their environmental baseline, they made the point that they would be putting their data into an industry standard geographic information database, or geospatial database that could be shared with the Secretariat, so that data would be going into effectively shapefiles and databases accessible through a common software interface. That seems to me to be the most common, most direct way to do this right now. I mean, there may be advances in the future, but I think setting a standard as to using a widely accepted standard for geographic or geospatial data would be a key part of defining databases, the database format to be shared by the contractors, whether it's for environmental data or mineral data.
So are you suggesting that we actually discuss this specification of the form of that data as
Well,
access databases or
we want the data to be shared. I mean, it has to be shareable, at least between the contractor and the secretariat. And the secretariat can't be expected to have a different system for anyone's preferred system. So specifying either a specific database format or at least one that is easily translatable to another ought to be a key part of the general specification of the resource database.
It's not obvious to me fundamental data except something that everybody supplies to us, which is standardized. The environmental data is the only data that has been described as not confidential. I'm not quite sure how I'm phrasing it, but what we're sharing would be more the environmental data than anything to do with the mineral data.
yes.
Just the LTC is putting a lot of effort in speaking with the contractors and try to find a template. Because sometimes there are data that is lacking the metadata, so we don't know the year of the cruise, the name of the cruise, the track of the cruise, and so on. So we are really trying to get a uniformized template to be given to the authority by the contractors.
Okay, so if I interpret that properly, you're really having these discussions already. And is there anything you think this group could add in that regard, or you think really they're progressing in the way you need them to?
Just, I feel that it won't be here that we would improve anything.
Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Sorry, I have to go back to the behind. We have a pre-feasibility study.
Could you move your microphone?
Pre-feasibility study.
Thank you.
On this issue, what could be the right time to have that pre-feasibility study? Who will certify? Because it should have a right time. It is not that just now we will tell somebody to come with a pre-feasibility study. Because what is the right time? And because it needs the input from all components of the work, starting from the resource, environmental issues, then the mining technology, then the process technology, and she has rightly added transportation. So who is going to tell that, or to the contractor himself will go for feasibility study if they feel so. But before going that, I think the technology issue also should be under their control, that they will be able to go ahead with the technology they have developed, whoever is the contractor. And that also linkage with the market. Because today's market may be favorable, maybe after 10 months it may go in a different way. Who is going to certify that is the right time to go for feasibility study and feasibility study? And that issue, how to address actually, because just saying that feasibility study does not give a good feeling that we are in the right moment.
Okay, thank you. I'll make an observation, perhaps, then throw it open. If as I think we've agreed, the term mineable area in the ISA document equates to a mineral resource estimate, and that the proved probable possible, as referred to in the ISA document, relates to measured, indicated, inferred resources, then when it says, okay, we need you to, we need the definition of the mineable areas and the estimate of tons of grade, etc., it is, as I interpret it, saying we need you to report to us your resource estimates as inferred or indicated or measured, whatever they might be. That's sort of that phase. The pre-feasibility study comes in when you convert from resources to reserves. So I think, and I may be wrong here because I'm obviously not fully up with the ISA documents and procedures, but it's moving to the exploitation phase. It's really saying, okay, now you've told us what potentially you thought might be economic to extract, which is the mineral resources. The next phase would be you have to tell us what you think you're going to actually economically recover, and you know the reasons why you believe that to be the case. And that's where you would then apply the pre-feasibility study at least, and subsequently a feasibility study in order to actually pin it down very closely. That would be my interpretation. It links back to the phases that the ISA requires of this, but I'm not, I say, really knowledgeable about this area, so need, yes.
I'm slightly confused. I don't see the ISA telling any contractor go to a feasibility study. That's a decision that the contractor itself has to make. It's not us. In reporting, if you haven't undertaken a pre-feasibility study, the word reserve doesn't exist. It's a resource.
No. I have a problem here. The reason is, mineable area does not speak about it is irrespective of the economics, market. That is a mineable area to have a certain ratio. Qualifying the mineable area, it requires the resource, then you have the slope angle, XYZ. But it does not linkage with the market, but it is a resource. But SG also talking about that linkage with this, the otherwise it does not have it cannot be told as a reserve or resource. But I don't fully agree. The reason is the mineable area, it is reflecting different issues, because that issues still it is taken into confidence all the parameters related to the economics and market condition. Then it is a feasibility stage. But contractor on its own decides, then they should be very confident that the market condition is such, it is a condition environment to go ahead for feasibility. But by the time this, because it is, if you see the market values of the copper, nickel, cobalt, even manganese as an alloy or whatever it is, if you see yesterday somebody presented, it was going ups and down, it is a sine car, and that is the driving force, because it may be that the driving force when the lower category, lower cutoff is also there, the market condition is very conducive. So these are the factors has to be taken into consideration. And in the format, if we talk about the feasibility study, that should also specify when to be that aspect has to be taken care of, because it is a question of continuation of the contract, because that is the point I'm making. Because if the economics does not prevail or the conducive to the environment to go ahead for the production or commercial scale, it is not the contractors the issue. It is a global issue, and you cannot just tell the contractor goodbye with all the data.
As to when to do a pre-feasibility study, I honestly don't see where the authority comes in. That decision is not for the authority to make for a contract. What I'm saying is you provide us with that information, say, by the end of exploration.
if you are still at the resource phase, clearly you're not going forward to do exploitation until it goes from a resource to a reserve. To get to the point of reserve, you would have had to do the feasibility study. But that decision cannot be made by, I just don't see it.
At the point also, as a part of the 15 years contract, contractor should be ready with the exploitation. That's the point I'm making, that because of this, the contractor will be told to that goodbye, because you are asking the contractor as a part of the signed document between ISBA as well as the contractor. Dotted 15 years, once it is touching, you say that you show us that the preparation for the exploitation of the nodule. That's why authority is also preparing the exploitation code. The process they are doing it. But on what ground you can say, I am putting that point, that goodbye, because we are not sure whether
Let me go back. The authority is not telling the contractor after exploration mine. It's a decision that has to be made by the contractor. If you have a collective device design that you haven't tested, I find it hard to believe that you would go forward and say you're ready to mine. I see those tests as part of the exploration process.
yeah.
You do up your own mine plan.
Yeah, it is as a part of the developmental activity of the area.
Yeah.
Yes.
So my difficulty is this. Your question is who makes the decision
Yes.
for the contractor? It has to be the contractor's decision. Sorry, please.
Taking India for an example, if the Indian government or whoever wants to finance a mine wishes to move ahead based on a resource estimate, that's up to them. Now, the exploitation regulations may set some additional qualifications, but right now, reserves are determined by the contractor based on their needs. It's the Crisco system was set up to facilitate a common way for people to evaluate the risk of investment. But if that's not an issue for a particular form of contractor organization, then just a statement to the authority of what the resources are and whether they're indicated or measured or even inferred would meet the requirements of the exploration regulations as they currently stand. So I don't think this is a conflict. But it's clear that this is to facilitate the people who need to borrow money, and the authorities need to just know that people are moving forward.
You see, this is a sort of a indirect imposition on the contractor, because hypothetically we are ready, but we cannot go because of global economy. Who will be penalized or demoted? Is a contractor. Is it feasible that way to contractor should say that get out from the area and give all the data and all this thing? Because I am taking a hypothetical view, everything is ready. Processing, your mining technology, what you are referring is you are yet to get it. But I am telling that hypothetical case. If this contractor is ready for processing and mining technology and resource position also, because they have done 15 years some work. But because of market condition, he is not going ahead. Is it feasible or imposition by the authority? You are not person or contractor not going ahead for exploitation, while exploitation coal is ready. But who should be penalized? Because I feel that contractor will be imposed in case such a thing doesn't happen.
Yes.
As I understand the problem, but it is really a theoretical one. I mean, if during the 15 years everybody did everything right, that did all the tests, all the things that they are supposed to do.
We are trying to do our best.
I know, and they have measured resources. Okay, but this is not the case. In fact, we saw yesterday that I think that easily from the pioneer investors, everyone has identified mineable areas, but they didn't yet perform the tests of the equipment. There are still processing problems to be solved and so on. So that is not the case. Now, we need to know, at least the authorities need to know what is the stage, what is the state of the knowledge about the resource. That's why I think we are here, to have a uniform classification for that. And based on that, we try to improve. But in fact, the interest is also from the authority, because we want the contractors to exploit, but also from the contractors, because you are taking the risk. Contractors are putting the money every year. So I think this is also the interest, and you know that this is the interest of contractors, and we know that. So we just expect to know the state of the knowledge, and it was very important, all the presentations yesterday. And now, knowing that, we need to start to see what we will need to go to proceed forward. So you must plan your activities, your work program of activities in order to improve that knowledge and in order to improve the resource classification. And then you will achieve this theoretical situation that you have everything, but the market conditions are not prepared, are not the best ones.
Sorry. You say, okay, I will go back another alternative. Say X is getting